Good evening and welcome to a special talk that we are hosting online this evening, linked to our very exciting exhibition at Colchester Castle, Gladiators, a Day at the Roman Games. There will be many opportunities, hopefully, throughout this evening to experience a little bit of what's in the exhibition, but also, hopefully, we will learn a little bit about Gladiators kind of outside of what's covered in the exhibition, and also talking about some modern aspects of spectator sports and weapons and fighting and lots of different things. We have a program of questions lined up to ask our special guest, but we also have the opportunity for anyone who's watching today to ask their questions. So if you post those questions into the chat on YouTube, they'll be passed along to myself, and there'll be a few minutes at the end of the session today to ask some questions, whether that's to myself about the exhibition or whether that's to our guest about weapons and gladiators in general. So I would like to introduce our guest for this evening, who is Mike Loades, who is a historical weapons specialist, who you may have seen on various documentaries, TV shows, all sorts of different things. And I'm very delighted to welcome him here today for this conversation. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Ben, and I'm delighted to be here. I wish it wasn't virtual. I wish I was there because the exhibition looks stunning.
Yes, well, we've been sharing lots of images of the exhibition on our social media, on our website, and lots of different places. And we'll bring up a few pictures today. So people who can't get to us as a museum will hopefully get a bit of a flavour of what it looks like, a bit of the design and things like that as well. So I'll start off actually with a little bit. So we have this idea, I think a lot of people, hopefully a lot of the people who are watching today, have this idea of what gladiators are or what they think gladiators are. We see them in film, we see them in TV, things like the film Gladiator or the TV series Spartacus. Probably people will think of things like the Colosseum, and you'll think of Rome. But when we started talking about gladiators in Colchester, there are a lot of kind of things we had to discuss because provincial gladiator fights are something quite special. There's something quite different going on, especially in Britain. And I think we'll touch on some of those elements a bit later on. So in the exhibition, we kind of look at a day at the games, a typical day at the games, specifically in Colchester. But of course, this would have varied in different places at different times. But we kind of decided to focus on three main things, really. One is the beast fights. So animals being used in the gladiatorial fights were a big part of that entertainment for the Romans. And there's a lot of things we can talk about around that. There was also an aspect of public executions, which is a much darker aspect of these games. Obviously, a lot of the aspects in terms of kind of the animals and things like that, very poorly treated. Lots of animals were killed in the arena. But in terms of gladiator fighting, that it's a very complicated kind of history that goes on with gladiators. But then you get to the gladiator fights themselves. So the gladiators were both revered and worshipped and seen as wonderful. I mean, you consider them celebrities today, but they were enslaved people for the most part, and they were people who lived kind of very limited lives. They weren't full citizens. They were considered as what the Romans called infames, which are kind of lower ranking people within society. So it's a very complicated story, and we have a lot of perceptions of how gladiators lived and what they did, but we're going to kind of discuss that a little bit today. And I know that you are an expert in historical weapons, so hopefully we'll focus on the weapons and the armour as part of that conversation. So I'd like to start with the first kind of prompt question to discuss. So this idea of, as I mentioned, this idea of popular culture and what we perceive gladiators to be. So how far do you think some of those shows or films have diverted from the truth? Are they quite accurate, or are they completely ridiculous?
It's going to be a yes and no answer all the way through. So the first yes is gladiator games were show business. Cinema blockbusters are show business. They have that in common. They use many of the same tools. They get there slightly differently. So yes. The other thing to bear in mind is that from the first sort of mention of gladiators by Livy 264, before Common Era, so BC in old language, until their absolute abolition by the Emperor Honorius in 404 CE AD. You've got, I don't know, you do the maths, but it's certainly over 600 years, 650 plus years. That's a chunk of time. That's a big span of time. So it wasn't the same all the way through. And in fact, there may have been Etruscan gladiators and things before that. So we are not talking about the same thing, even if we take the two examples you cited, Spartacus and the Russell Crowe, Ridley Scott film Gladiator, 250 years between them.
Yeah.
You know, when was Spartacus rebellion? Sort of 70 BC, something like that. And then Commodius is sort of 80-ish, sort of CE 80. So that's 250 years of massive amount of development. So you're not talking about the same thing. And one of the things that happens with cinema history is, of course, all the little strands and clues all get conflated as if it all happened in one moment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it didn't. And that makes it very hard for us to unpick all those moments.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think a lot of the kind of perceptions and people kind of draw when they're creating film or TV from more recent depictions as well. So one of the things we have in the exhibition is quite a famous painting from the 1800s called Pollice Verso. I don't know if you've seen that painting before. Mm-hmm. So I'll try and get that up actually. While I'm trying to get a picture of that up, I'll kind of try and explain what it is. So it was a painting that was done in the early 1800s that shows a gladiatorial scene. So it shows a kind of victorious gladiator standing over his kind of defeated enemy, looking up at the crowds, and with the emperor visible, with the Vestal Virgins visible in the kind of audience. I believe it's meant to be the Colosseum is where it's set, and you can kind of get a sense of it being the Colosseum where it's set. So it's got a very grand look to it, which of course, again, that wouldn't be the case for provincial amphitheatres like here in Colchester necessarily. Let's see, we've got it here. Can we see that picture?
Yeah.
So that's the wall in the exhibition. So that's the painting.
And looking very Victorian. It looks
yeah, well, exactly. So I think
looks like a Victorian musical. And it's a continuum. It's a same legacy of entertainment with just a little less blood. But it depends on stock characters. As did the Commedia dell'arte or the Punch and Judy shows, or all of these things. It's this stock character. So there we've got the victor who is characteristically a murmillo. We can tell that by his helmet, that very distinctive sort of dorsal fin crest. And he's standing over his familiar foe, the Retiarius, who is the net man, net and trident man. These are stock characters, and I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent yet. We'll perhaps get to how the different types of gladiators fought later. But my opening point about this being a great span of history that in films is condensed with all the influences put into one moment, you would have to be very careful whether you were showing that. So the heavy fighters are like the Murmillo here, but also the Gaul or the Samnite or the Thracian or enemies of Rome, until they weren't enemies of Rome. So you don't want the wrong one popping up in the wrong era if you were really trying to get it right. But coming back to why the show business side of it is more similar. There was a thing called gladiatorial games. People were killed. It was brutal, and the audiences, the crowds loved it. That's the most depressing thing about gladiatorial games.
Yes,
is people loved the bestiality of it all, and etc. Today, the appetite is still there. Action films, dangerous sports, we still have that appetite, but we do draw the line slightly differently.
Yes.
I mentioned that live games are different to cinema. One of the ways they're different is smells. The aromascape is very different.
Yes.
So you don't, unless somebody next to you's got a very large bucket of popcorn, you don't have smell in the cinema. But if you go to the games, whether they're provincial games in Britain or other areas of the empire or at the Colosseum, I'm pretty sure the air would be filled with the smell of the animals. The animals fights and mock hunts happened in the morning. And you know, when we read the Colosseum, we're talking about thousands of animals. Well, I'm sure they could still muster several dozen or even a few hundred in Colchester. You know, Colchester was not an insignificant place in sort of 60 AD. So, you know, they would run around. I remember as a kid, I mean, I grew up in the 1950s with traveling circuses, and the circus used to be in the recreation ground right opposite our house. I spent a lot of my childhood hanging around circuses. And I remember that smell very, very distinctivly of elephants and tigers and zebras and all. You know, it's powerful smell. The sort of sound. But if you're putting on a gladiatorial games and you've invested God knows how many tens of thousands of sesterces in putting this on to please the public, for reasons we can come to, and you're slaughtering all these majestic animals, well, you might as well cook them and feed them to the populace. So I'm sure the animal games were in the morning because I'm sure they ended up on the spits. And so what you would have had would have been thousands of barbecues, of braziers, of glowing coals and smoke floating through the arena, and the smell of roast beer and roast oryx and good roast stag and goodness knows what else to feed to the populace. So that is an atmospheric thing that you're never going to get from the cinema.
Multi-sensory, lots of
multi-sensory. The smells are one thing, but sounds. In the cinema, we're all rocked in our seats by, you know, Dolby surround sound, vibrates through the whole body and all that. And most of the sort of clangs and clashes and rings and dings of the fighting is done by a Foley artist in the basement studio in New York somewhere, you know, banging on a tin tray or something. That is not the sound you would have heard live. And sound is very, very important. If you watch an action movie on your television and you turn the volume down, it doesn't quite work. Sound powers narrative action. It's absolutely crucial. And I think it's one of the factors that drives the design of gladiator armor. So just to prove that I can hold a thread, or the picture you have up, showing our gentleman there. Now look at that helmet. In any military sense, it's a preposterous design. What helmets do throughout history, and they have a certain commonality, that they're to protect the head, obviously. And one of the ways they do it is gauge how thick it is, but it's deflecting surfaces. You look at all gladiator helmets, apart from the secutor, and that's a special case, all of them, and what they have are catchment surfaces. The brims are extra wide, and they're not turned down for a glancing blow. They're turned up to catch a sword ding. Even the neck plate at the back, which is distinctive on a legionary's helmet, but it slopes down. On a gladiator's helmet, it tips up. Here, you can appear to be cracking your man on the head, but you're not. You're catching him just to the side, and you're making a wonderful, deafening ring echoing around the arena. So they're hearing the blows and landing sound blows with discomfort, probably, but relatively convenience to the inhabitant of that helmet. And what you get from that, if you look at some films, I won't name any, but the sword fighting tends to be sword against sword.
Yes.
Trying to create that musical percussion track, which is what powers the action. Now, that wouldn't wash with a Roman audience, I don't believe, because many of them would have seen service, and they would know that you don't actually sword fight by dinging your swords together in a sort of Morris dance fashion. That what you have to do is go for the man, not go for his sword.
Yeah.
The man, the sword can deflect it, but that's a different thing. You'll get some deflection with a sword, but mostly it's dodging and moving and getting out of the way with those type of swords. So that when you can land a blow on this purpose-designed gong that you're wearing on, then it gives a surprise to the audience. Oh, he's got him. That's exciting. And that being able to get that moment of surprise, action narrative. You always have to be surprised. Now, the tools that the cinematographer has are the edit room. And so you never see an image for more than 4 seconds on a TV screen. The longest you'll ever see an image is 4 seconds. Cut, and a different shot size for every image. Now, when you're sitting in a stadium, you're just seeing the same shot size all the time. So you have different challenges to create surprise and excitement. Now, probably the most iconic moment in the Ridley Scott Gladiator is when the tigers come up from the Hypogeum. Totally credible. Don't know if it was ever done, but totally credible. They had tigers. They had these capstan winch lifts that could bring wild animals up in an instant through trapdoors. They could have men holding on to really it's surprise. It is the absolute stuff of drama. And an action director like Ridley Scott knows that.
Yeah.
But history doesn't matter because he's not making a documentary. He's not trying to teach you history. He's giving you action. And that's what was happening in the arena. They weren't trying to give you history. They were trying to give you action. They're giving you history only in the sense that the Thracian and the Samnite and the Gaul, etc., were at one stage enemies of Rome. And so you're showing Rome's dominion over its former enemies.
Yeah.
But they change over time. The Samnite becomes the Hoplomachus. The Gaul becomes the Murmillo, because the Gauls are now citizens of Rome. So you can't have him as the enemy anymore. So you get that slide. But you have these theatrical stock types. I'm probably talking too much, and you probably want to.
No, not at all. It's really interesting. No, it's very, very useful. And and you're right. And the design, and we'll have a look at some of the other bits of armor in a minute. But you're right. The designs are really interesting in that they, now you kind of pointed out that they're designed to be caught. They're designed. They're a target.
They're a target. They make it easier to get a clang and always got him. They make it easier to register a hit, rather than any other military helmet is about deflecting.
Yeah.
And this is a personal opinion, of course, but I find gladiators look a bit silly.
Yes.
And I'm probably not alone in that. Although I'm sure they have their supporters, and we'll get letters. But I have a passion for arms and armor, or I always have, throughout the ages. And one of the things it has in common, armor in particular, is a beautiful sculptural form. And it has beauty to me because it's form following function. And that function is to defend the person against the weapons of the day. And when it's done right, when form and function mesh perfectly, there is a beauty with it.
Yeah.
Whereas with gladiators, the function has slightly been perverted. It's not there to protect you. It's there to... And then we get to the sort of the Michelin Man for a generation who remember that all the body armor of these thick arm and leg wraps, big thick fabric pads. Now, if you look at a Roman legionary, right, it's got bare legs, bare arms, and a protected torso. You look at many gladiator types, there's so many, they're all different. But if you look at many gladiator types, they've got all this wrapping around the legs and around the arms and bare torso. It's the negative image of the positive. It's the exact opposite of a legionary.
Yeah.
So it's telling us something.
Yeah.
Whether I interpret it right is another matter, but that is telling us something.
No, I agree. It's a mirror. It's a mirror of the real world.
Mirror image of the real world. It's a theatrical act.
Yeah.
And what it does, it protects pretty much all of them, even though they're bare-chested, have the big, thick belt. Often.
Yeah.
So the viscera
are
generally pretty well looked after.
Yeah.
And unless you drive it through the rib cage, which does a pretty good job of protecting heart and lungs, you can get a lot of crowd-pleasing blood painted on a chest and back with some light slashing blows.
Yeah.
Not for the faint-hearted.
No.
But there's plenty of people today who partake in extreme sports, like, mixed martial arts, but they don't draw blood, but they wouldn't mind. You could just tell from the personality types that if it was on offer, they'd be up for that.
Yeah.
But I mean, other sports, rodeo riders, it's so much more dangerous than being a gladiator.
Yeah.
We don't have actual facts but getting on a bucking bull, neck breaking, back breaking.
Well, people get really injured in those sorts of
really injured. Today we have spectator dangerous sport, rodeos, Formula One racing. The only thing with Formula One racing is the protective gear has got better.
Yeah,
it all comes down to the protective gear, but the danger of it, the people are not necessarily wanting an accident, but the potential for one, it's there.
Yeah, that's the excitement.
There was a bloodlust, and it was stimulated by the bestiary games, in the morning. It's a strange and fascinating phenomenon, but I don't think we're as distant from it as we think we are, or we'd like to think we are.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think another thing, you mentioned the armor and the placement and kind of to allow that blood loss. I know that another aspect of that was the gladiator diet.
Non-fatal blood loss.
Well, exactly. So that's the thing. I think that the other part of that was the gladiator diet. So they used to eat a particular diet to ensure that they developed this layer of fat under the skin, so it would kind of be protective, but also allow blood to kind of, if they were cut, then it would allow blood to be kind of drawn, and that would add to the spectacle.
The only thing I can think of that commends me to being a gladiator, that carrying a little extra weight is actually a virtue rather than...
Yeah, they still had a very restrictive diet. Unfortunately, you wouldn't be able to just eat whatever you liked and put on a bit of body fat and you'll be fine. Because we know they at one point one of the nicknames for gladiators is hordeari, which means barley people, barley men. So they had a lot of porridge, kind of barley porridge. That was one thing that they ate. Which porridge is fine. It can be tasty, but they probably didn't have any jam or honey or anything with it. It was probably just kind of basic diet. Yes. So and didn't really eat meat. Didn't kind of there were lots of foods and things that they weren't allowed. And again, it's down to allowance, because you have the head of the gladiator school would be kind of monitoring their intake of kind of food and drink and things, would be kind of monitoring their exercises, making sure they were practicing, doing all of the kind of things that they need to do, like you say, to ensure entertainment in the arena, to ensure that when they do go out there, that they are putting on as much of a show as possible.
Absolutely. And they were showmen in a fairly sort of populist, tacky, showbizy sort of a way.
Yes,
Gladiator, the film, and so it's it is doing the same job, but it has to use different tools to get us there.
Yeah.
So the soundscape, the smellscape, the visual, you haven't got close-ups, which is what drives action. But you can get a clanger. You can say, "Oh my God, he's really bleeding," and it's live, and there hasn't been an edit cut, so I know it's true.
Yeah.
And the screams of the crowd.
Yeah, well, perhaps should we move on to the next kind of topic that we had down, which, I mean, talking of sounds and smells, is the animals. So we know that in kind of, again, that iconic image of the Colosseum and kind of the images you see in things like Gladiator, the one thing is the kind of the range of animals that they might have had in the morning events, but also kind of the sheer number of them, as you alluded to, the sheer quantity of animals that might have been kind of in the arena at any one time. And we know that animals were killed quite kind of casually. And some of those would have been predator animals, so they would have been putting on a show, they would have been fighting back. And some of those were not predatory animals, and they were kind of more considered as kind of hunting. So you have the Venatores, who were more hunters. So it was still watching that spectacle of bloodshed, but it was in a slightly different way. So again, kind of as we focus here on Britain and what was going on in Britain, how do you think the games, and especially the animal kind of the beast fights, how did that compare here to some of the things that we think of when we think of things like the Colosseum?
Well, I mean, obviously it was more limited to the Colosseum is an extraordinary piece of engineering. That hypogeum, that below stage area with all those winch capstan operated lifts and trapdoors, and to give you theatrical surprise after surprise, but must have been extraordinary. And the fact that you could flood it and fill it with alligators and I mean, all of that kind of stuff. You probably couldn't do that in Barnsley, but nonetheless, somewhere like Colchester is pretty important. It's not insignificant. Now, the difference between stone and wood and earth doesn't necessarily make an inferior amphitheatre. We've got some pretty impressive earthworks in the United Kingdom, the Roman period and earlier. You could make a wonderful arena with earth banks, and carpentry was pretty sophisticated. And probably a lot, you could probably get some decent carpenters a lot more easily than you could today to make pretty stylish, pretty wonderful stands and traps, in the sense of release pens for animals. You could have tented corridors to drive the animals in. So it was a surprise until the animal actually got into the arena of what animal was coming in. I think they would still need to mimic the idea of the Colosseum. The Colosseum came quite late, don't forget.
Yes, of course.
The Colosseum's really quite late on in the story of Gladiators, not until Vespasian. They've been going a long time before that, as have the beast hunts. So I think the beasts are really something where you've got the essence of circus and surprise, because you've got the sound of a tiger growling, you've got the sound of an elephant trumpeting still echoes in Colchester. From Claudius, allegedly. Whether he actually rode one, is another matter. But that's a sure sign that elephants were sent over, most probably.
Yeah.
What's that doing to a British population? It's showing them the power of Rome, the reach of Rome, the dominion of Rome over the natural world. That now these client kingdoms can become part of Rome. And wow, what a thing to belong to.
Yeah.
Wow, I could be Roman. We own the world. This is extraordinary. I didn't know such creatures existed. They could have come from alien planets, or from Africa. Nobody would have seen creatures from Africa before.
Yeah.
But the Romans could bring them to Britain. But then you could also have animals indigenous to Britain: wild boar, aurochs, wild cattle, stags, these kind of things.
Yeah.
So and you mentioned there's a difference between bestiarius and venatores, and we're not quite sure where the line is and what the difference is. But basically, the bestiarius are sort of have to fight the beasts, and the venatores are more like skilled hunters, but maybe even more like modern day lion tamers, or 1950s lion tamers, with tricks and that sort of thing. But there's other gladiators that, when you read lists of gladiators in the small print, you see there was a Laciarius, the lasso man. Well, maybe the lasso man, we know nothing about him other than he had a lasso. So maybe from conquests in the East, most horse archers also carried a lasso. It was a weapon of war on the battlefield, because all nomadic tribesmen begin as herders. So maybe it's showing dominion over them in a gladiator fight. But I think more likely the Laciarius was another form of venatoris. He's put in
early cowboy.
A 20-pronged stag, and he has to get that. Or even the what's his name? I'm trying to think of the Sagittarius, the archers.
Yes.
You could have two archers shooting each other in the arena. More likely, I think, to stick an archer in there against a wild beast. So you've got a lot of variation in these from animal tricks to, as you mentioned in the introduction, to criminals being put in to be executed by a bear, a long and tortuous, painful death, to the venatores and the secretary and the lassomen showing to me. What does that show to a British audience? That's that Britons as opposed to British of the period. It shows Rome has dominion over you. All the animals in your realm we train, and we bring animals from all around the world, and we own them. We own the natural world, and we own all our enemies. And I think that, because you've asked particularly to refer to games in Britain, I think a popular one from the Romans' point of view, a little talked about gladiator, would be the Esidarius.
Yes.
Esidarius was the charioteer. Now, we see a chariot in the film Gladiator, but that's completely wrong, because it's got sides on the side, and the only people who ever put sides on the wheel, very, very briefly, because it was such a bad idea, because you've got a lot of blue casualties, was the Persians, and Alexander the Great, several centuries earlier, managed to deal with that. So it's not period correct, and it has an archer in it, and it's just... And Esidaria, however, is not that type of chariot anyway. It's not a stand-up shooting a bow and arrow chariot. It's a sit-down chariot. The clue is in the word. It's a sedentary chariot, an Esidaria. And Iron Age European chariots, from the little iconography we have from coins and stela and other images, the chariot driver is invariably sitting. Always sitting. Now, you can have a standing warrior who would throw javelins. And we have the wonderful account by Caesar when he first encountered British chariots, when he came over in 55 BCE, that they would gallop down steep hills, could turn, that they would run up the pole. And this is entertainment. My golly, this is already entertaining. You've got chariot race thrills and spills already, and then you pit them as gladiators against each other, and you show that they're under Rome's control. And Rome has beaten them. That the great chariot warriors of Boudica are now subdued and absorbed into the Roman Empire. They, as I say, it's a seated chariot. It's specific to the Iron Age chariots that we see in France and Italy and Britain, and that's the word they use. They don't mean any other sort of chariot. There's other words they could use for those other sort of chariots. So I think that's very much the message they would be bringing. We've subdued you, and the games are all metaphor.
Yes, yeah, and it would have been so familiar to all the people in Colchester, the people of Colchester who had been here for decades, centuries, to then see that image. They would know exactly what the Romans were.
This is your type of gladiator. This is your people. This is how, just like after they had the Gaul and the Samnite, and the Thracian. All these, Thracians are from Bulgaria, and Rome conquered that, and then they absorbed them, and then the Samnites are from the Italian peninsula, but early on Rome conquered them, so they were one of the first symbolic types of gladiator.
Seeing as we're talking about different types, I thought I'll bring up an image of one of the star objects in our exhibition to kind of talk a little bit about some of the types that we do see in the arena. We've mentioned most of them all already. We know, as you said, there were kind of countless different types, all had different purposes and functions. But this is kind of our spotlight object, really, in the exhibition, on loan from the British Museum, found in Pompeii, that iconic Murmillo helmet that was used by the fish people, the Murmillos, whilst fighting the Retiarii, the net people. So just kind of talking a bit about that, maybe kind of those different oppositional types and how they worked.
So two things. So one of the things that's interesting about I believe there is no evidence, i.e. rivet holes or anything like that, for any kind of chin strap.
Okay.
And it's a great big top heavy thing. So again, instead of being the most efficient and comfortable protection you can have, it actually becomes a little bit of a handicap.
Yeah.
Because if he gets his net on it and it pulls you off sideways, or you've actually got to keep yourself pretty upright and work like that with it. So, but people would know that, okay, he's being symbolic, but he's also got that little bit of, he has to work in a certain way to do that. But you have this idea of opposites. Well, that's dramatic conflict right there.
Yeah,
you've got the heavy brigade, you've got the Samnite, the Hoplomachus, the Gaul, the Murmillo, the Thracian, the Secutor, the Provocator. These are all the heavy brigade with heavier armor. And then you've got the light brigade, the Retiarius with his net, and the Dimacharius, who just a loincloth and a belt and a couple of short swords, or the Velites with a spear, although again I think they might be beast fighters rather than but the drama is clearly who's going to do better, the heavy man or the light, more agile man. One will lose stamina earlier because he's got heavier gear, but he's more protected. People will take their choice. The answer, of course, is the one who will win is the one who's best.
Yes.
But it sets up a visual drama.
Yes, it does.
The Retiarius is an odd one, isn't it? Because it's not mimicking anything in military life.
Well, I wondered, because this is the thing. Obviously, well, not obviously. So we know the Murmillo is as I think you mentioned, was originally that it was the Gaul. The Gaul then sort of developed into a Murmillo. Whether I don't know whether this what came first, it's sort of chicken egg scenario, but the word Murmillo comes from a Greek word for a particular type of fish, murmilos, and I think it was like the idea was this helmet, the type of helmet, looks a bit like a fish's face. You've got the kind of fin at the top, and you've got the big bulbous eyes almost where the face guard is. So then perhaps the Retiarius was developed to catch the fish as a kind of a bit of it, because you've got the trident, of course, as well, which is the symbol of.
Yes, so in other words, this has echoes of old helmets with the high crest and things. You go look at you with your high crest. Oh, you fish face. and so it becomes, you know, a popular culture term that they're calling the Gauls fish face or whatever. And then they go, oh, well, let's design a fisherman to catch fish face. And yeah, in that kind of low-level popular entertainment arena, I could quite see that happening.
Yeah.
The thing about the Retiarius, who looks so vulnerable, again, it's what we get is as much display of flesh as possible to give a canvas for blood. But most of the vital bits are protected. So again, he's still got a decent belt protecting all his, you know, intestines and stomach. He's still got a decent thick leather or plated belt. Most of them have. And the Retiarius also has a defense on his arm here. That was the top of the shoulder, and it sticks up there, protecting the side of his face. The problem with that is as soon as you lift your left hand to throw the net, you clonk yourself in the face. It like, oh, that's like good protection, but it's a terrible limiter to being able to throw the net. So the net is problematic. I've tried working with them. They're quite tricky. So they're a type of net which today we call a Sen net. So it's a circular net, and it has weights around the outside, so that there's a way of spinning, throwing it, and it spins in the air beautifully and lands and get the fish. But it travels through the air quite slowly. No, there's not a chance that anybody under 95 couldn't dodge out of the way in diving. So the Murmillo needs to be incapacitated before you can have the visual satisfaction of netting him. You can fight with the net in other ways because it's got these lead weights around the edge. I mean, you basically can use it as a flail. I mean, so it's got that kind of, you know, weighted flail whip-like quality. So you can smack him around the back of the neck. You can catch him around the back of the legs. You could trail it in front of you, trying to lure him on, because if you look at the helmet at the bottom, the one you have on the screen, you can see that at the bottom his downward vision would not be very good. He probably can't see his own feet. So if you're trailing that, if you're careful and you trail that net on the ground and kind of bringing him in, then you might be able to give it a good tug and have him on his back with that and then drop it over him. So it's that kind of tactic might work, but you're mostly going to be fighting with the trident, which is a three-pronged trident. And although the Murmillo may be very grateful primarily for the air intake that helmet gives him, but also for the, you know, relatively reasonable vision. Although his face would look like a fish, because the reflection of light on there would make your face look quite scaly. But you think of a trident jabbing at that, the tips of the trident are actually going to go through. It's going to be quite scary, but it fortunately stands away from the face enough that the tip of a trident, but it's almost, those rings, apart from creating the image of scales on the face, they're almost like a catchment area for a trident. But it couldn't be more perfectly designed. To catch a chance. So a good face stab might unbalance him, and as we say, if the helm's a bit wobbly, that would do that. But he was replaced with the secutor, and that is where we get a difference. I don't know if you've got an image of a secutor helmet.
Let's see. I think we should do. Let me just get something up. Yeah, they are very different. Like you say, they're a bit sleeker, I guess. It's kind of design.
It's the exception that proves the rule. Although it has another point, which I will wait for an image.
Do we have? We have a few. Oh, here we go. This is a nice one. This one's actually another
No such thing as one. They're awful helmets. Horrible.
Let's get this one up. So this isn't a helmet. This is a depiction. So one of the things we have in the exhibition as well is lots of figurines and other kind of things that depictions of gladiators. So this is in fact a figurine that's been loaned to us from the British Museum once again. So this is the Secutor helmet.
Marvelous. You see, that shows the Secutor helmet.
Yeah,
wonderfully sinister and it looks like a Cyberman from Doctor Who.
Yeah.
Those who've not seen Doctor Who, American viewers or whatever, it was a sci-fi series that has run throughout our lives, and it's a Time Lord who travels, and one of his familiar enemies in the early days looked just like this. If you can see, I think even at this angle, that it does the opposite of what most helmets do. So what you need with a helmet for vision, the closer the eye holes or the visor is to the eyes, the better vision you have. The further away they are from the eyes, the worse your vision is.
Yeah.
One of the bad things about wearing a helmet is lack of airflow, claustrophobia. And you can see this one, instead of coming in like this, I'm sorry, instead of being like that, which puts the eye holes near the eyes and gives you plenty of breathing room and clearance from the face from heavy blows coming in, this does the exact opposite.
Yeah.
It's smushed up against your face, so you can hardly breathe. You've got the metal against your face and the eye holes are way away.
Yeah.
So it has a sinister, but it's doing that thing that so often seems to be happening with the design of gladiator equipment. It's doing the mirror image of what you would really need in reality. Yeah. But it also it's strangely prescient. Now, I know they didn't know this, but it's strangely prescient of a medieval diving helmet.
Yeah.
There's one in the Middle Alta Centre in Denmark. It's just like it. And you think of that, and a fisherman, but anyway, Secutor, the one, became the sort of stock opponent of the Retiarius after the Murmilon went into decline a bit.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And while we're on helmets, because I realise we're rapidly running out of time, I could chat to you for hours with this, but we'll move on to something a bit closer to home for us in Colchester anyway. Yes. Which is the Hawkton helmet, which was found in Suffolk, not too far away from where I am right now. And so the idea is that perhaps this was from a gladiatorial fight, maybe in Colchester, or at least somewhere nearby, because it's from kind of the local area. And Colchester would have been one of the biggest towns at that time. So here we have it on display. It's I've done a little close-up so we can hopefully see it in a bit more detail, but it's in our armory case in the exhibition. So we've got a few other objects. If we have time, we can maybe touch upon as well. But the helmet is the kind of key thing I wanted to talk about.
Just to that point I was making right at the beginning, look at the size of that brim.
Yeah.
You could really ding that with a sword and get the effect that you're striking your opponent without actually hitting him.
Yeah. So this is a nice local example. I'm not sure. I think there's been some speculation over type of gladiator that might have wore something like this. As you can see, it's not complete. There's a lot of it missing. It's quite broken. So it's quite difficult to say which type of gladiator would have wore something like this. But it, like you say, it's got that iconic wide brimmed neck guard, which didn't really. Well, it's more of an attractor than a guard.
It's more of an attractor because if it's not sloping down, like, I mean, you do have wide brims on many legionary helmets, but they slope.
Yeah.
This is not. This is almost upturned, and that I think is a significant difference. It could be like a sort of a provocateur, which is another type of gladiator, and we should make the point because we've made the point about. For dramatic effect, they often pit opposites, a heavy
Yeah.
man against a lightly armed man. But they also put like against like a lot. And the provocateurs were most often put against each other. And the provocateurs were the ones who were, their kit was most similar to that of a actual Roman legionary.
Yeah.
They really represented Rome. I could see this being part of a provocateur's kit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating object, and it's one that, because it's so close to Colchester, is a really important part of this exhibition, because it kind of gives us a sense of the kind of gladiators that might have actually been here, rather than just thinking about, again, the lovely Murmelo helmet, although it's a wonderful example of its type, comes all the way from Pompeii. And Pompeii, much like the Colosseum in Rome, would have been having kind of different spectacles, different scale of events, having gone on for much longer than kind of they would have been in Britain. Like you said at the beginning, these events went on for centuries. The Roman Empire went on for centuries, and this was a part of that from since before the Roman Empire existed, and quite close to kind of the end of the Roman Empire's presence in Britain. So it's a fascinating object to kind of think of local kind of armor and weapons and style, because that's the other, like you said, it's form as much as function. It's how it made the gladiators look in the arena and attracting that kind of attention.
Yeah, and the function was to put on a show.
Yes,
the function was to get some dings and clangs and some streaks of blood. But gladiators, by the time they came to Britain, certainly, were expensive.
Yes.
And not lightly dispensed with.
No.
And you know, the Lannister, the guy who ran the gladiator school and hired them out, you know, he'd need a lot of money if you actually wanted one to be killed. So, you know, we don't have any real facts and figures of how dangerous it was. It was certainly brutal.
Yeah.
It was certainly reprehensible. And as I said earlier, you know, the worst thing about it is how much the crowd loved it. That's the most depressing thing about it. But this shows you that, you know, what's so wonderful about an exhibition like this and about an artifact like this. I mean, I come from Norfolk, so I'm not a million miles away. So, you know, East Anglia, it's a part of the world that I know. It's real. And it's like, that actually happened there. That was worn by a real person. Wasn't in a movie, wasn't in games I'm reading about. This is a real helmet worn by a real person who lived in that society where these things were done. It really brings it home.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of what we wanted to achieve. And I think what most museum exhibitions try and achieve is it's partly telling that wider, broad story, kind of what generally happened at a day at the games, what generally happened for gladiators, what were their lives like in general. But another part that we are lucky that we can do is share those personal individual stories. Now, we don't know who this person was. We don't have a name. We don't have their backstory. We don't have their life history, but we know they were a person. We know there was a person who wore that. And they were a life that lived here in East Anglia, like you say. And that gives so much.
It's very evocative.
Yes, exactly. It gives you a whole layer of kind of empathy and understanding. And you think, well, I live in East Anglia.
Yeah.
2,000 years ago, would I have been that person? Would I have been at the games watching them? Like, how do I fit into that narrative? And it's great that we can bring such a wide range of objects together in this exhibition to tell those stories, both individual personal stories and this bigger picture as well of the gladiators and the games that happened here in Colchester.
Absolutely.
One thing I will touch upon as well before we're closing up to 8 o'clock. So I'll get this down for a second. There we are. So finally, we've talked a bit about kind of like parallels and things like that already, or kind of modern popular perception. We talked a little bit about some of the parallels. We mentioned Formula One and things like that. So kind of finishing off this conversation today, do you think there are any kind of accurate modern parallels to the gladiator games? Obviously, no one's being killed in the arena nowadays, really. But are there any sports where you think you can see kind of very clearly those same sort of?
And I mean, the mixed martial arts. I mean, they're heading, to greater and greater extremes are hurting each other. It's it's a combat sport. It's a scrap, and that's what seems to get the crowd going. So on the human side, we're definitely heading toward that. Where I think it will go is through virtual reality and gaming.
Yeah.
That we will be able to do it virtually without the social and legal consequences of damaging another person.
Yeah.
I still find it so depressing that people will want to do that.
Yeah.
Because it's innate in the human species.
Mm-hmm.
How that translates to somebody sort of putting on a games in the sense of, why were the Romans doing this? Were they doing it to get elections, or particularly, you see, when we talk about the Colosseum and Rome, and it's always, the senators or the emperor putting on the biggest games that anyone's ever seen, so you all vote for them. And you could see that motive. What would be the motive to put on a sort of a virtual games? I suppose would be enabling it to create an arena where people could come and put on the headsets and do something, but it doesn't quite have that incentive yet. But I fear somewhere in our future, gladiatorial combat, where people watch other people hurt each other for sport, has not yet left our species. I'm happy to say, however, that we are at least better with animals.
Yes, I think animal treatment is getting there. And a bit of a ray of hope, maybe, that I will kind of also add into this is that even in the Roman period, now we know, like you said, and again, it's a popular perception thing, and it unfortunately probably was the majority of Romans that did enjoy the spectacle. But we do know there were people who didn't. There are accounts of people who didn't like it. Cicero is a prime example. So we know even at this time, where in our kind of popular understanding of the gladiatorial kind of combat, we feel like, oh, the Romans, they were awful. They all loved this gore and bloodshed. How awful were they? There were some that didn't. There were some that were vocal about the fact that they didn't like how animals were treated, in particular in the arena, and the games in general.
Yeah, it's a good point. No, it was vulgar entertainment as well. I know, and cultured people looked down upon it.
Yeah, and that's why eventually women weren't allowed to attend. That's why the games eventually died out, is because of the changing morals and attitudes and things that developed over that centuries of history.
30 seconds I could do. You mentioned women and changing attitudes. We probably should mention that female gladiators did exist. We're not quite sure to what extent. There is a wonderful little statuette in the British Museum of Amazonia and Achillea, obviously arena names, stage names. And Juvenal wrote savage satires decrying them. We don't know to what extent. Very minor, very little presence, but yes, there were female gladiators. Just thought we should mention that.
Yes, definitely, and that's something we do touch upon in the exhibition. We included a female gladiator in the exhibition. Unfortunately, they're wearing a helmet, so you can't necessarily tell, but we do talk about it as a subject, and we know that they existed. And again, the nature of provincial kind of gladiatorial games, although women were banned from competing eventually kind of within Roman law, who's to say they didn't fight in the fringes of the province at different points?
Absolutely.
Different times.
Who knows what went on? Well, I mean, the one in the British Museum is from Halikarnassus, Bodrum in Turkey, for instance. It's from the Roman provinces.
Yeah. So I think that's it's an important point to end on, is that it wasn't just these big burly men who were fighting and drawing blood. It was at different points. It was women. It was entertainment for everyone. It was kind of the big spectacle that everyone would have attended. but as time went on, it gradually disappeared. But I think we have to end there. So thank you very much, Mike, for that conversation. It's been absolutely fantastic to chat with you about these subjects. If you're interested, anyone watching, in kind of more things like this, please check our website. We have regular events and programs coming up over the coming months that will hopefully cover more kind of subjects, whether it's gladiators, whether it's other things that we like to cover. But yeah, so thank you, Mike. And
my very great pleasure.
And yes, have a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.